Geronimo. One name that, by the autumn of 1886, had pulled a quarter of the standing United States Army into the deserts of two countries. 5,000 American soldiers, 3,000 Mexican troops, telegraph lines, heliograph stations blinking messages across mountain peaks, railroads repositioning entire regiments. All of it mobilized against a single band that, at its largest, never exceeded a few dozen men, women, and children. The final holdout numbered 38. Somewhere in the Sierra Madre, an old warrior who had already survived more than 2 decades of continuous war looked at those numbers and made a decision that historians still argue about today, not because the outcome is in doubt, but because the reasoning behind it has never been fully settled. What convinced a man who had eluded capture for 25 years, who had walked away from surrender before, who believed himself protected from bullets by forces no army could outgun, to finally lay down his rifle in a canyon that didn't even have a name on most maps? This is the account of how one man became, in the eyes of 2 governments, worth more military resources than most declared wars, and of the contradiction sitting at the center of that fact. The machine sent to break him was in its very size the thing that almost let him win. Before the manhunt, before the newspapers, before 9,000 words of congressional correspondence about a single fugitive, there was a boy named Goya Way, one who yawns, born in June of 1829 near a tributary of the Gila River, in territory that belonged, at the time, to no nation but the Chiricahua Apache. He was not born a chief. He had no hereditary claim to command. What he had, by every surviving account, was an unusual stillness under fire and a memory for terrain that bordered on the supernatural. On March 6, 1858, that quiet life ended. A column of roughly 400 Mexican soldiers under Colonel Jose Maria Carrasco struck the Bedonkohe camp outside the town the Apache called Casquille, while the men, Goyawe among them, were trading in the settlement. When he returned, his mother, his wife, and his 3 children were dead. The camp's weapons and horses were gone. There was nothing left to fight with, and nothing left to fight for except the fighting itself. Not despair. Design. Goyawe did not simply mourn. He rebuilt himself around a single permanent objective, and he did it with a discipline that would define the next 3 decades of his life. He walked to the camp of the war leader Cochise and asked for men. Mangas Coloradas, his own chief, granted him support for a retaliatory strike into Sonora. And in that battle, the first of what would become dozens across 2 nations, witnesses on the Mexican side reported something specific: a warrior who ignored a hail of gunfire to close the distance with a knife, again and again, until the soldiers facing him began calling out in desperation to a 4th-century saint associated with protection in battle, Geronimo. The Spanish name for that saint stuck, not because he chose it, because his enemies gave it to him in the middle of trying and failing to kill him. That detail matters because it previews everything that follows. Geronimo's name was not a title bestowed by his own people in celebration. It was a word his enemies used while afraid. Now recede from the man and look at the world closing in around him. By the 1870s, the United States government had committed to a policy of concentration, forcing scattered Apache bands off ancestral lands and onto reservations, often ones chosen for administrative convenience rather than habitability. In 1874, roughly 4,000 Apache people were relocated to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a stretch of arid, malaria-prone lowland that bore no resemblance to the cool mountain country the Chiricahua and other bands had called home for generations. Rations arrived late, or spoiled, or not at all. Agents changed. Promises did not survive the change. Here is the asymmetry, stated plainly. The United States, in the 1880s, fielded a standing army of roughly 25,000 men, backed by a national rail network, a functioning telegraph system, and a federal treasury capable of sustaining prolonged campaigns across state lines. Mexico, exhausted from decades of internal conflict, could still field thousands of soldiers along its northern frontier and had every incentive to cooperate against a common raider. Between the two nations, the resources available to hunt one band of Apache were, for practical purposes, without limit. What the United States Army did not have and could not buy was terrain knowledge. Geronimo and the Chiricahua bands operated across the Sierra Madre, a mountain range so severe, so lacking in reliable water, that conventional cavalry units routinely broke down, attempting to follow trails the Apache crossed on foot in half the time. Every canyon had a name in the Apache's own geography, and no name at all on Army maps. Every water source was cataloged in memory, generation over generation, in a system no outsider could replicate in a single campaign season. The United States Army knew Geronimo's approximate numbers. It did not know his ground, and it consistently underestimated what a band of 30 could accomplish against a division-strength pursuit, because it kept measuring the war in soldiers per square mile instead of knowledge per square mile. That miscalculation is the hinge this entire story turns on. Hold on to it. It will return. In May of 1885, after yet another cycle of broken promises and reservation restrictions, Geronimo led roughly 130 followers off San Carlos and into Mexico. General George Crook, the Army's most experienced Apache campaigner, understood something his superiors in Washington did not: that defeating Geronimo militarily in open terrain was close to impossible. So Crook did something unconventional. He recruited Apache scouts, men who knew the same land, the same signs, the same water, and used them to track their own kinsmen. It nearly worked. In March of 1886, after months of pursuit through the Sierra Madre, Crook met Geronimo in Cañón de los Embudos and secured his surrender. And then, on the very night the agreement was to be finalized, a traitor sold whiskey to members of Geronimo's band and reportedly warned them they would be killed the moment they crossed back into American territory. Whether the warning was true almost didn't matter. Geronimo weighed the risk, and by morning he was gone, slipping away with 39 followers into darkness, leaving Crook to explain, by telegraph, to a furious War Department, how the most wanted man in North America had walked out of an active surrender. Crook resigned within days. His replacement was General Nelson Miles, a commander with none of Crook's patience for negotiation and every intention of ending this by overwhelming force. Miles's answer to an enemy who could not be outmaneuvered was to remove the possibility of maneuvering at all. He committed 5,000 American soldiers, very close to a quarter of the entire United States Army, supported by roughly 3,000 Mexican troops operating south of the border. He built a network of heliograph stations across the peaks of southern Arizona, flashing coded signals over distances no runner or rider could match, so that a sighting in one canyon could reach a waiting column in another within hours instead of days. Cavalry sealed water holes, infantry blocked mountain passes. Soldiers destroyed the food caches and hidden supply stores the Apache depended on for survival, denying the band any chance to rest through the brutal heat of a Sonoran summer. It was, by any measure, one of the largest manhunts in American military history, aimed at fewer than 40 people. And for months, it still did not work. Here is the detail the Army did not want to say out loud, and that its own commanders would later admit in writing. The machine built to catch Geronimo was, by its own scale, too heavy to move at his speed. 5,000 men need supply lines. Supply lines need roads, or at least passable trails, and predictable water. Geronimo needed almost nothing. A handful of warriors, moving light, could vanish into country an entire cavalry regiment couldn't safely enter. General Crook had written of the Chiricahua's abilities in terms close to reverence, describing an acuteness of sense, a physical endurance, an intimate knowledge of the land that gave them what amounted to an early warning system no telegraph could replicate. The very asset the United States had built its campaign around, overwhelming numerical force, was becoming its greatest liability. A giant cannot be quiet. A giant leaves tracks a child could follow. And for 5 months, the largest manhunt in the nation's history chased a man across mountains he knew better than anyone alive. What finally shifted the balance wasn't a battle. It was exhaustion, applied on both sides at once, and one specific piece of information the Apache scouts working for the Army did have. Not Geronimo's location, but his psychology. Miles understood, through those who had negotiated with him before, that Geronimo would not respond to force. He had already proven that force alone could not move him. What Geronimo would respond to was a guarantee, however fragile, that his people would not be separated and would not be executed on sight. So Miles sent Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, an officer the Chiricahua had come to respect during earlier campaigns, deep into Mexico's Sierra Madre, with a small escort and a message. On July 13, 1886, Gatewood was ordered into the mountains to find a man that 5,000 soldiers had failed to corner by force. He carried no army at his back. He carried a name Geronimo trusted and terms Geronimo might accept. This is the moment worth sitting with before it resolves. A campaign that had absorbed the equivalent of a quarter of the American military, heliographs, cavalry, infantry, an entire foreign army's cooperation, was, in its final act, decided not by superior firepower, but by a single officer walking into the mountains with almost nothing and a conversation. Now, briefly, a decision has to be made, because everything that follows depends on which detail lands first, the negotiation or the terms. The negotiation is what most retellings rush through. It deserves the pause instead. Over several tense days at Skeleton Canyon, near the Arizona-Mexico border, Gatewood delivered Miles's proposal: surrender, exile to Florida with his people, and an eventual return that, history would later reveal, the United States government never intended to honor. Geronimo, exhausted, his band reduced to 38, agreed. On September 4, 1886, he handed over his rifle to General Nelson Miles. It was the last formal surrender of the Indian Wars in the American Southwest. Not because Geronimo had been defeated in the field. Not once, in 3 decades of raiding and pursuit across 2 nations, had a conventional force cornered and destroyed his band by force of arms. He surrendered because the asymmetry that had protected him, knowledge over numbers, mobility over mass, could not outlast a war of pure attrition waged against people who had nowhere left to rest, resupply, or hide their children. Before this story closes, one more fact belongs here, because it reframes everything that came before it. Geronimo and his band were promised they would be reunited with their families and eventually returned to their homeland. Instead, they were shipped by rail to Florida as prisoners of war, including the Apache scouts who had helped track them, men who had served the United States Army loyally and were imprisoned anyway, indistinguishable in Washington's eyes from the enemy they had helped defeat. Geronimo would spend the last 23 years of his life in captivity, first at Fort Pickens and Fort Marion in Florida, then in Alabama, and finally at Fort Sill in the Oklahoma Territory, where he farmed, joined the Dutch Reformed Church, and in 1905 rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, presented to the crowds not as a threat, but as a spectacle. A man once pursued by a quarter of the United States Army sold souvenir photographs of himself at world's fairs for pocket money. He dictated his autobiography in 1906 to S.M. Barrett, one of the only accounts of the Apache Wars told in a resistance leader's own words, rather than filtered entirely through the accounts of the government that had hunted him. He died of pneumonia on February 17, 1909, still a prisoner of war, still waiting for a homecoming that never came. The numbers that opened this account are not exaggeration. They are documented military record. 5,000 American troops, 3,000 Mexican soldiers, heliograph networks, entire cavalry regiments, deployed against a band that by the final weeks numbered fewer than 40 human beings. And what finally ended, it was not the weight of that machine. It was one lieutenant, one conversation, and a man who had already decided, 28 years earlier, standing over the bodies of his family at Cosquillet, exactly what he was willing to lose before he would stop fighting. Empires do not usually fall to bigger armies. They fall to the moment they mistake mass for mastery, when the size of the force sent to solve a problem becomes the very reason it cannot move quickly enough to solve it. Geronimo was never defeated by the United States Army. He was, in the end, simply worn down by its size, the last man to prove that a nation can send a quarter of its military after a single opponent, and still be forced, in the final hour, to negotiate.